Good evening. We're here in the Space Shuttle Flight Control Room, continuing with some of our interviews. Today we're being joined by the Flight Dynamics Officer for this Orbit 3 team, Marc Abadie. Thanks for joining us.
Sure.
You're the Flight Dynamics Officer. Why don't you start by telling us a little bit about that position and what that all entails?
Sure. So our position, Flight Dynamics Officer, we are essentially responsible for anything that is trajectory related for the shuttle. So it's our responsibility to make sure and manage basically what the shuttle trajectory is throughout the flight. What that really means when you break it down in the orbit phase, it means, I'll give you a few examples of what we pay attention to. Before rendezvous, our job really is to ensure that the shuttle's orbit can get safely from the initial orbit that we establish after launch to the International Space Station's orbit in order to dock with the International Space Station for a mission like what we're having here. And to do that, we have to raise the shuttle's orbit with a series of burns. And not only do we have to hit the altitude of the ISS orbit, but we also have to hit the point in space where the ISS is in that orbit. So as you can imagine, there's quite a bit of calculation that goes into determining what those burns, that series of burns needs to be, hit that point in space at the right time with the right constraints. So up until docking, our job is largely focused on that. Other things that we are interested in during the flight, one example is making sure that any debris or other orbiting objects do not come within, a distance of the shuttle that's unsafe. And so throughout the entire mission, we're actually working with some other folks to monitor these items that are in orbit and ensure that they're not, coming in within a certain distance of the shuttle. As you may have heard in this mission, we actually had a situation that was along these lines, and we had what was called a conjunction with one of these objects. The time of closest approach was soon after docking, and for a couple days prior to that, once we had identified the potential risk, we actually put a plan in place to consider moving the International Space Station and the shuttle in order to avoid a potential collision with that object. We worked closely with our International Space Station counterparts to put that plan together. Unfortunately for this flight, we didn't have to execute that maneuver. In the end, additional information on the object proved that it was a safe situation and we didn't have to do the maneuver. But that's another example of what we pay attention to during the shuttle mission. Third example is at any point during the mission, we need to be prepared to bring the crew home if some unsafe condition exists. And so throughout the mission, we're ensuring that the crew has the ability to come home to a landing site, and that protects us against any number of systems issues that we could have, like a cabin leak or whatever. But it's really just to protect for those contingency cases and make sure that the crew has an out. So throughout the mission, we're observing what those landing site capabilities are, what weather is at those landing sites, and we're monitoring the orbit to know whether or not we can reach a particular landing site at a given time. So that's really the third area that we focus on. There's others, but those are three key areas that we focus on throughout a mission.
I'm curious, how far in advance of a mission do you start working, like the docking type of plan?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's very important for us to understand what the International Space Station's trajectory is going to be, obviously, because even well before launch, we are concerned with what orbital plane we need to launch into in order to have a safe rendezvous with the International Space Station. So well before launch, we're observing the International Space Station trajectory, what their plans are, if they have any reboosts planned or any trajectory plans that could change our rendezvous plan. And I'd say anywhere from 6 months to maybe even more, depending on the scenario that we're looking at.
Okay. And for this case, like you mentioned that there was conjunction and a possible TCA, and how much additional work does that add for your team to be monitoring that situation? Just kind of curious what that workload is.
Sure. It depends on the scenario. For this case, it was actually pretty considerable. During the rendezvous time frame, which really begins with that initial orbit after launch that I mentioned, up until the point where we dock with the International Space Station, that 2 to 3 day period is a pretty intensive period for us to begin with, and so when you stack on top of it, you know, an analysis like this, it can get pretty challenging. So for this particular case, because it fell at that time, it actually was pretty challenging for the teams to work together. Also, the coordination that needs to occur between the International Space Station team and the shuttle team can add a little element to it as well. And since the time of closest approach was after docking in this case, it was very important for the two teams to coordinate and make sure that they both agreed with the plan that we had.
And also, you're supported by backrooms. How many team members do you have backing you up, and how do you all work together?
It varies based on what point of the mission we are, but in general, we typically have 2 folks in the back room that support navigation. So they help us know at any given time what the estimated orbit is of the International Space Station and of the shuttle. It's very important for us to know what the location of those vehicles are at any given time with a certain accuracy. And then we also have a couple folks who actually help us with the rendezvous. We have a Mars officer, which is the maneuver and rendezvous specialist, and his sidekick profile support. And those folks help us put together what the rendezvous plan is, so that series of burns that I discussed, and how that series of burns will ultimately bring us to a docking with the space station. And so they help us manage that as well as any contingencies associated with that plan. We also interact throughout the flight with our landing support officer, LSO, and that person is helping us keep abreast of what the landing site situations are throughout the world in case we need to utilize one of those sites other than what we have planned at the end of mission. So.
Okay, thanks so much for the overview on your job. Now let's turn a little bit more to your personal story. Can you tell us a little bit about your background, where you grew up and where you went to school?
Sure. So I actually grew up in a suburb of Dallas, Texas called Richardson, and pretty much lived there throughout my life. We actually moved there when I was a year old. I was born originally in a suburb of New Orleans, Metairie, and then moved to Dallas and lived in Dallas throughout my schooling. And then graduated in high school there and stayed in Dallas to attend the University of Texas at Dallas for 2 years before moving down to UT Austin for my undergraduate and graduate degrees.
And what are those degrees
in? The fields. So I actually I studied aerospace engineering for my undergraduate as well as for my graduate degree. And in my graduate degree, I focused on guidance, navigation, and control.
So when did you decide or know that you wanted to pursue a career at NASA?
It's an interesting question. So basically, I pretty much followed my interests throughout. When I was in high school, I recognized that I really enjoyed math and science, and so I took that, and when I went to college, I looked at what fields really utilized math and science. I found engineering, and then after being in engineering for a while, I sort of explored the different subject matters in engineering and realized that one had aircraft and space flight as an area of study, and I really enjoyed that, so I pursued that, and then from there, NASA became an option, and I decided to take a position down here at the Mission Operations Directorate. So. And
now that you're in this role, what do you find is the part of your job that you enjoy the most?
I'd say what I really enjoy the most is working with so many just fascinating people. I think many of my coworkers humble me on a daily basis. Their aptitude and then their work ethic, all of it, really, it humbles me a lot. I learn a lot from the folks that I work with, and I try to give that back to the new folks that come in from college. So I definitely enjoy that. Another thing that I really enjoy about my job is knowing that at any given moment, you know, all the training, all the studying that we do off console, that at any given moment we can be called upon to really put all that together to help the crew and maybe, you know, save the mission or even save the crew if it's a really bad contingency case that we're looking at. So just knowing that you know, we're there to help in that way, that I love that about the job.
And what do you find is the hardest part?
You know, I'd say the hardest part is really when challenges in each of those areas I mentioned before, when they stack up on us, I think that managing the workload for situations like that can really be difficult, and making sure that you manage it in such a way that it's effective and gives you the outcome, obviously, that you want.
All right. Well, we're only at flight day 3, and you've already done a lot on this mission. I hope the rest goes really smoothly for you, and thanks for taking the time to talk with us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right.